You hear footsteps behind you in the marble corridor, but when you turn, there's no one there. Just the echo fading into the latticed shadows of the harem's inner quarters. You've been a servant here for 3 years, long enough to know that some women arrive and never leave, long enough to notice that certain faces simply vanish between one sunrise and the next. No farewell, no explanation. Just an empty room and a name that everyone suddenly pretends never existed. Tonight, you're summoned to the Valide Sultan's private chambers, a summons that comes without warning, without reason. And as you walk these corridors where silk whispers against stone and incense masks something darker, you begin to understand in the Ottoman Harem there are 2 kinds of disappearances, the ones they talk about and the ones that ensure silence forever. If you're listening to this from anywhere in the world right now, leave a comment with your location. It genuinely amazes me how a secret kept behind palace walls for centuries can reach someone halfway across the globe today. This is the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, sometime in the late 16th century. During the reign of Sultan Murad III, the harem isn't what most imagined. It's not a perfumed fantasy of willing concubines draped across cushions. It's a complex political institution, a state within a state, where over 1,200 women live in a labyrinth of interconnected rooms, courtyards, and corridors that most of the empire will never see. At the top of this hierarchy sits the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, wielding power that could topple viziers and redirect the course of empire. Below her, a cascade of carefully ranked women, the sultan's favorites, the concubines, the servants, the slaves, and at the very bottom, nearly invisible, are the ones who clean the marble, who carry messages in the dark, who witness everything and are expected to remember nothing. The servant's silence isn't optional. It's purchased through a system so methodical that it took historians centuries to piece together, buried as it was beneath layers of official denial and deliberate bureaucratic omission. Because what the Ottoman court perfected more than architecture, more than administration, was the art of making people vanish without a trace, without scandal, without the outside world ever knowing a name had been erased from existence. Elif arrives at the harem at 14, purchased from a slave market in Circassia. She's assigned to the lower kitchens, where servants prepare the elaborate meals that travel through a network of dumbwaiters and hidden passages to the women above. She's grateful for the work. It's better than starvation. Better than the alternatives she'd faced in a region devastated by war and poverty. The harem provides food, shelter, clothing. It's brutal, yes, but it's survival. And there's a promise whispered among the new arrivals. Serve well, stay invisible, and perhaps one day you'll earn your freedom. A small pension, maybe even a marriage arrangement to a palace official, but Elif notices something within her first month. A girl named Ake, who worked beside her peeling vegetables, mentioned one morning that she'd seen something strange, a late-night procession of eunuchs, carrying what looked like weighted sacks toward the palace's private docks on the Bosphorus. 3 days later, Ike's sleeping mat is empty. The head servant, an elderly woman with eyes like flint, announces that Ake has been reassigned to another estate. When Elif asks which estate, the woman's hand moves so fast the slap barely registers as motion. Questions, she says quietly, are a luxury you cannot afford. The lesson is immediate and absolute. In the harem, curiosity is the most dangerous indulgence. Here's what the Ottoman archives reveal, in the careful language of bureaucracy. A line item in palace expenditure records, labeled Disposal of Unwanted Materials. The amounts are small but consistent, appearing in account books year after year. Historians initially assumed it referred to damaged goods, broken furniture, unusable supplies. But the timing was strange. These expenses spiked after major harem scandals, after whispered rumors of poisoning attempts, after moments when political intrigue threatened to spill into public view. It took a French diplomat's private letter, discovered in the 1970s, to decode what disposal actually meant. He describes, with barely concealed horror, a conversation with a retired palace eunuch who'd been bribed into speaking. The eunuch talked about the Sabenkler, the night gardeners, whose job wasn't to tend flowers, but to ensure that certain witnesses to certain events would never testify. The method was grimly efficient. A servant who'd seen too much, heard too much, or simply existed as a liability during a succession crisis would receive a particular summons, always at night, always delivered by a eunuch she'd never seen before. she'd be told the Valide Sultan had a special task, a confidential errand. And because refusing the Valide was impossible, because obedience was survival, she'd follow. The destination varied. Sometimes the marble hammam, empty after midnight. Sometimes a windowless storeroom in the harem's oldest wing. Sometimes simply a corridor that ended at a door she'd been told never to approach. What happened next was designed for silence. Strangulation, usually quick, quiet, leaving no blood to scrub from marble. Sometimes poison, slipped into a final cup of sweetened tea that tasted like mercy after a long day. The bodies were sewn into weighted silk sacks, carried through passages that only the eunuchs knew, and deposited into the Bosphorus from the palace's private docks, under cover of darkness. By morning, the girl's belongings had been distributed. Her name removed from the roster, her existence reduced to a gap that closed seamlessly. The way water settles when a stone sinks. But here's the detail that makes the whole system even more chilling. It was legal. Not in the sense of written law, the Ottoman legal code didn't openly endorse murder of servants, but through a doctrine called the right of household discipline. The harem was considered the Sultan's personal domain, an extension of his absolute authority. What happened within those walls was beyond the reach of the imperial courts, the religious authorities, even the Sultan himself in many cases, because the Valide Sultan exercised near-total autonomy. She was mother, administrator, judge, and executioner. And if a servant posed a risk to the harem's secrets, to the dynasty's reputation, to the delicate political balance that kept the empire functioning, her removal wasn't murder. It was housekeeping. Elif survives her first year, then her second. She learns the invisible rules. Never make eye contact with anyone above your station. Never repeat anything you overhear, not even to other servants. Never be alone with a eunuch you don't know. Never, under any circumstances, witness something you're not supposed to see on if you do. Forget it immediately. Erase it from memory. Let it die in your mind before it kills you in reality. But forgetting isn't always possible. One night, Elif is carrying linens through a corridor in the older section of the harem when she hears crying. It's coming from behind a door that's usually locked, a room she's been told stores winter carpets. The sound is muffled, desperate, and distinctly human. She freezes. Every instinct screams at her to walk away, to pretend she heard nothing. But the crying intensifies, and she recognizes the voice. Fatima, a young concubine who'd caught the Sultan's attention briefly before falling out of favor. Rumors had circulated that Fatima was pregnant, a complication that threatened the succession plans the Valide Sultan had carefully arranged for her preferred son. Elif's hand reaches for the door handle. She doesn't know why, maybe compassion, maybe foolishness, maybe just the stubborn human refusal to ignore suffering. The door opens. Inside, Fatima sits on the floor, wrists bound, face bruised. She looks up at Elif with eyes that contain no hope, only a terrible recognition. "Don't," Fatima whispers. "Just go. Forget you saw me." But it's too late. A shadow moves in the corridor behind Elif. A eunuch steps forward, his expression neither angry nor sympathetic, just resigned. Like a craftsman interrupted during routine work. "You were not summoned to this hallway," he says quietly. And Elif understands with absolute clarity that she's just crossed a line from which there's no return. Here's where the story fractures into two possibilities, because the historical record pieced together from fragments offers both outcomes. In the version preserved by one account, Elif is taken that night. Her body joins the others in the Bosphorus, weighted down by silken stones, her name appearing on no death record because she was never officially recognized as having died, just reassigned, just gone. Another gap that closes, but there's a second version, found in a memoir written decades later by a woman who claimed to have served in Topkapi's harem. In this account, Elif is saved by an intervention, not mercy, but calculation. The Valide Sultan's closest advisor, a senior eunuch with decades of palace experience, argues that killing Elif would be wasteful. She's young, healthy, and could be more useful elsewhere. So instead, Elif is sent to a provincial estate in Anatolia, hundreds of miles from Istanbul, bound by a contract that forbids her from ever returning to the capital, ever speaking about what she saw, ever contacting anyone from her past. It's exile masquerading as generosity. A disappearance that leaves the victim alive, but erased nonetheless. Both versions might be true. Because the genius of the Ottoman harem system wasn't that it always killed, it's that it didn't have to. The threat was enough. The knowledge that disappearance was always possible, always plausible, always just one wrong moment away, created a culture of self-policing, more effective than any surveillance. The servants became their own jailers, monitoring their thoughts, strangling their curiosity, killing their questions before someone else killed them. The paradox deepens when you examine who disappeared and who didn't, because the pattern wasn't random. Lower servants vanished with disturbing frequency, dozens per year during politically turbulent reigns. But women higher in the hierarchy, the educated concubines who'd studied music and poetry, who'd borne the sultan's children, they rarely disappeared, even when they fell from favor. They'd be pensioned off, married to officials, retired to estates. Their visibility protected them, their connections, their literacy, their ability to write letters that might escape the palace and reach foreign diplomats. These created a buffer against erasure. It was the invisible ones who vanished, the illiterate, the friendless, the ones whose absence wouldn't generate questions because no one with power cared enough to ask. The system didn't just exploit their labor, it exploited their disposability, the cold arithmetic that some lives could be subtracted without affecting the empire's, some. A document surfaced in the 1980s from the Ottoman Imperial Archives. A ledger from 1595, the year Murad III died, and succession chaos engulfed the palace. It lists unusual expenses during the transition. Among them, payments to fishermen for discretion regarding salvage rights in the palace waters. The amount suggests dozens of transactions. Historians still debate the exact interpretation, but the timing aligns with accounts from foreign ambassadors who noted that the Bosphorus near Topkapi seemed unusually active with sunken debris during that period. The ledger offers no names, no details, just numbers. Payments for silence about what washed up on shore. That's how the system worked, not through confession or record, but through absence and implication, through numbers that suggested horror without confirming it, through a bureaucratic language so neutral it could mean anything and therefore admitted nothing. The harem's disappearances continued for centuries, adapting as the empire evolved. By the 19th century, Western pressure forced some reforms, more oversight, written contracts for servants, nominal protections, but the fundamental power structure remained. A closed world where absolute authority answered to no external check, where disappearance was always an option, and where the disappeared were designed to leave no trace. When Topkapi Palace was finally converted into a museum in the 1920s, after the Ottoman dynasty collapsed, workers renovating the harem's lower levels discovered something: a small, windowless room with walls covered in scratched messages, names, prayers, dates, carved into the plaster with what must have been fingernails or hairpins. The inscriptions span decades. Some are in Turkish, some in Circassian, some in languages the archaeologists couldn't immediately identify. Most are fragmentary. "Mother, forgive me, I saw nothing." The room wasn't part of the official harem structure on any architectural plan. It existed in a gap between the schematic and the real A-space that was used but never acknowledged. A holding cell, an interrogation room, a last stop before the Bosphorus. The museum catalog lists it simply as room of unknown purpose, which is perhaps the most honest classification possible. A space defined by what was never officially recorded. They kept the room as they found it, behind glass now, part of a guided tour that moves quickly past, uncomfortable with lingering. The scratched names are still their most unreadable, eroded by time and damp, but some clear enough to make out. Fatima. A Caliph, common names, yes, but the dates align with gaps in the servant rosters. With years when reassignment expenses spiked in the ledgers, there's no plaque explaining what happened in that room, just a brief sign. Servant quarters, 16th-18th century. The museum guides, when asked, repeat variations of the same carefully neutral answer. Records are incomplete regarding the full experiences of harem servants, which is true, in the same way that saying material was disposed of is true, accurate, bloodless, a fact that contains an absence where the truth should be. The visitors move on. They photograph the ornate tiles in the sultan's chambers, the gold leaf in the Valide sultan's salon, the magnificent fountain in the courtyard, where sunlight fractures into rainbow shards. They leave thinking they've seen the harem, the architecture, the luxury, the exoticism. What they don't see is the infrastructure of silence that made it function, the hidden passages where bodies moved unseen, the ledgers where deaths were coded as expenses, the system that required some people to vanish so that others could live in gilded rooms and call it civilization. Because that's the dark truth the palace walls still contain. The Ottoman harem wasn't just maintained by servants, it was maintained by the possibility, the ever-present, carefully cultivated possibility, that servants could become ghosts. That existence was conditional, that seeing too much, knowing too much, being too much of a liability could be resolved through a midnight summons and a weighted sack and the cold swallow of the Bosphorus. And the most haunting part isn't that it happened. It's how efficiently the system made it unhappen, how thoroughly the disappeared were erased, not just from life, but from record, from memory, from the historical narrative. They were written out of the story before their stories could be told. The Bosphorus still flows past the palace walls, dark and swift, and somewhere in its depths, beneath centuries of silt and forgetting, lie the silk-wrapped secrets of an empire that perfected the art of making people disappear without ever admitting they'd existed in the first place. Stand on the palace docks today, where tourists take photographs of the glittering water and the mosques rising against the skyline. Listen closely beneath the sound of waves and seabirds. Some silences echo louder than screams.